Good evening and welcome to the Research Triangle PowerShell user group. We are excited to have one of our leaders give a talk tonight about an introduction to Microsoft Graph and figuring your way around it. And I turn it over to Jeremy.
Hey, how's it going, everybody? So I am Jeremy Brown. I've been in IT for a little over 20 years. I've posted some of my contact info here. So my GitHub repo, which has just public stuff that I play around with, it's not there's not a ton in there. Most of what I write can't be published publicly. And then my Twitter handle, if anybody wants to reach out to me, I'm always available. Just hit me up. So tonight we're going to talk about the Microsoft.Graph PowerShell module, and it's a way for us to interact with the Microsoft Graph service. And I just switched jobs. So previously I was working with AzureAD and Microsoft Online Office 365 stuff almost completely. That was a big portion of my job. So I had automated a whole lot of what my previous organization did inside that environment. And I noticed that I would speak and talk to people about the fact that I needed time to continue to take all this code and start updating it to use Graph, the Microsoft Graph endpoint. And people didn't understand what was going on. And I realized that really, I think Microsoft's not done a very good job of talking to people about the differences between the way the modules work on the back end. And then most importantly, they're killing some of those endpoints, and people don't know that. So the Azure AD and the Microsoft Online modules, which is probably what most of you are using today, they authenticate and interact with what's referred to as Azure AD Graph. And the Azure AD Graph endpoint is going to go away. And I posted a link right here from the notification from 2 years ago. In fact, we can yeah, we can go here and look at it. So this is from June of 2020, the write-up about the fact that they're going to kill off the Azure AD Graph API, and that affects Azure AD and Microsoft Online. And the big part of that is this piece down here, which I actually have an entire slide for just that paragraph coming up. But Azure AD stops working in less than 6 months. And people don't know that. It's when I say that, people are like, wait, what? And it kind of freaks them out. And so I thought this would be a good talk to kind of help spread the word. So what we need to be working on right now is taking anything that's using the Azure AD and the Microsoft Online modules and moving them into the Microsoft.Graph SDK or Microsoft.Graph module. And again, here's that thing. What they're saying is right now, June 30th, 2022, when you go to connect Azure AD, you're going to get nothing back. And that's going to hurt a lot of people. Personally, I think that no one's prepared for this. And as soon as they do that, they're going to end up pushing that deadline to a later date. And that's when everybody will start to learn about this. So I say get a head start on that and go ahead and start looking at where your automation is today using Microsoft Online and Azure AD and start looking at what we can do or what you can do to move to the Microsoft Graph module. So that's kind of why I think this is such an important deal. What everything that we know today is essentially going to be gone, and Microsoft's going to unify into what is called Microsoft Graph. And it's going to be that one single endpoint for all of your work. So what is Graph? So Graph is the gateway into all of the Microsoft 365 services. So there's an entire ecosystem around this with a whole bunch of different REST endpoints that will let you pull data for whatever you want that's in the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. The easiest way to go learn and play with that is to use this Graph Explorer. The Graph Explorer looks like. I put on that one? Not yet. Looks like this. We'll just type in Graph Explorer, go here, and then we're gonna do that. Then we're gonna big in it. So the Graph Explorer looks like this. By default, it'll sign you in with a sample user account, and there's not much that you can do against this account other than query against yourself. If you have an account in a AzureAD tenant, then feel free to sign in with your account, and that will give you a greater breadth of things to play with. So anything that you do across this Graph Explorer then is going to kind of show you what you would get back. If anybody is familiar with, the name just escaped me, Postman. This is kind of like a Postman for Graph, right? So up top, we can build the query, run the query, and then on the bottom, we'll get the response from whatever the query is that we ran, and whatever, the data that would have come back from that, or at least a portion of it if it's a large set of data. So up at the top, after you have your query, you can come in and specify any sort of extra data that might belong in the header. We can change the permissions that we're giving our user to see if that helps with what we're querying, stuff like that, right? So this is their tool for kind of exploring the Graph API. I find that when I'm even using the Microsoft.Graph module, I play in this tool quite a bit. The module itself doesn't really give you a lot of feedback back, and the errors aren't the best errors. And so figuring out how I want to build my filters and whether or not I'm even looking at the correct endpoints, those types of things, I'll usually come in and kind of play in the Graph Explorer first on those endpoints and kind of get an idea of what the data that I'm working with is before I move to the .graph module. And then once I'm there, I have a better idea of how I'm going to write that code. So that's the Graph Explorer. We're going to play a little bit more with that in a minute. So for what we want to talk about tonight, the question is how do we use Microsoft.Graph? And so step one is install the module. So install module name Microsoft.Graph. And then from there, you're going to choose the API version you want. If we take a look back at the Graph Explorer, you'll see where it says version 1, there's also a beta option. The endpoints for these two are mostly the same. There's a few things that are different in two different ways. One, the beta, of course, has a few extra API endpoints that the version 1 currently does not have because they're not released for production yet. And then the other one is sometimes in the beta, the endpoint might be the same, but the parameter sets that are allowed to be used will be different, or they'll be kind of the same. Like they might have two parameters that are return the exact same thing, but they're literally named something totally different from each other. So you want to be aware of which endpoint version you're using when you go to write your code, and then make sure that it lines up correctly for that endpoint, right? And so just here, like I can use version 1 and beta. On the Microsoft.Graph module, we would select MG profile, specify the -name parameter, and then give it the name of whichever endpoint. So by default, it'll come in as v.10. And if you want to switch to beta, then you would run this command right here, and that would switch you to the beta endpoint. And then once you've selected which endpoint you're going, or which version you're going to call, then you would execute the connect MG graph and then pass in the scopes that you want. And that's how you'll authenticate to the graph service and be able to interact with your information. The scopes can be reread on the fly. So if you're not sure what you're about to do, start small and then work your way out. So if I'm exploring, I would only ever use a read scope. I wouldn't use the read write scope, just because I know if I use the read scope, I don't ever have to worry about changing data with something that I'm not quite sure about how to use yet. Whereas if I choose the greater set of permissions from the read-write scope, then I run the risk of doing something I didn't intend to do while I'm exploring, right? So start small, use the read scopes, and then when you're ready to branch out and go bigger than that, you can do that interactively by reissuing this connect.mg graph with a force refresh switch, and it'll give you those new permissions on the fly. So it's really easy to do, and we'll actually do some of that here in a second, play with that. All right, so let's take a look at what this looks like. So I'm going to pull up my PowerShell window here and try, all right. We're going to go this way then because is that big enough? Can everybody see that?
Can you make it a little bit bigger? Oh, and Jeremy, I think you're muted. You got muted by accident.
Yeah, that's a little too big, isn't it?
I think it's okay.
Is there something in between? All right.
That's good. Leave it there.
All right. So yeah. So like I was saying, so if we do get module Microsoft.Graph star. So this is the way it comes in. So you'll go to install the Microsoft.Graph module, and manifest will pull in the rest of the module, right? So you'll see it works like the AZ module does. So everything will be broken out into smaller namespaces across each piece of this. So the Microsoft.Graph itself doesn't really hold any commands. Everything is held inside something a step lower. So if we were interested in interacting with users, we would look inside the Microsoft.Graph.users. If we're dealing with groups, there's a Microsoft.Graph.groups, right? If we're going to deal with bookings for the booking service, or if we want to deal with setting up audit data for the identities, stuff like that, those were part of it, the identity sign-ins. So there's mail, like, okay, anyway, so all of them exist across these different ones, right? And if we want to look at how they work, then we would do that by going into a specific one. So let's do git command from the module. We'll just grab the users module. And this would give us all of the commands that exist inside that particular portion of the graph module. And if we want to know how to use git, let's do git mg user. Then we could, pass in the help git mg user. And that would give us the parameter sets and then the information, some basic information about what each of the parameters work off of, right? So most of the time, if I'm doing something like this, I pass in show window, and that will open it up into its own little window. We saw this earlier today. So I think Phil was doing this. And if I'm on a machine that doesn't have internet access, I find this works pretty well, right? If I do have something with internet access, then I prefer to just head to the docs themselves and read it from here. And the same content that's in show window will exist on this website as well. Sometimes you'll get a little bit more feature-rich data. For example, some of these features. However, I find that most of the commandlets in the Microsoft.Graph module have very little information in them. it is exactly what would be in show window, right? It looks like this one right here. So you'll get a couple parameter sets and then a description of each of the parameters, and that's all you get. One of the things that I would like to see is for each of these commands, if they would just tell us what permissions we need. Because usually I have to come into the Graph Explorer or the graph documentation itself. So if you go to Microsoft, so if we come in and look at the graph documentation itself, which one do I want? Let me just go back to here, go back to here. That's the one I want. Yes, okay. I did go to the right place. I didn't feel right. Okay, yep, so where's my, there we go. So in this instance here, we can go and let's go take a look at listing users, for instance. So get MG user ties to the same thing as the list users inside here. And I can see that because they're both retrieving a list of users objects. And this is where you would actually learn the permissions that you need. So in my instance, so I need one of these particular permissions in order to be able to list the users using get MG user. If I don't pass in user read basic all, user read all, one of these as a scope, then when I execute get MG user, it's going to give me a permissions denied. And we can watch that happen right now, actually. So let me clear that out. So like I said, install the module. Clearly, I've already done that. So if I do a get MG profile, so I'm currently using the version 1 snapshot, which is what I want. And then I'll do a connect graph, and then you'll pass scopes. So if I don't pass scopes, then I'll just connect to graph with nothing at all, right? So let's do that. So, and now if I do a get MG user, why is that working? Oh, because I'm probably signed in as this user. Well, that's fine. I can make this error happen in a minute. Because I'm doing a get and I'm already signed in as this particular user who has permissions, it's actually doing what I want it to do. But if we go to do a creation, it should fail. And so we'll see that in a second. I can make that fail. But if we want to change our permissions, run connect graph again, pass scopes, and then pass the scope that you want, and then pass force refresh. And this will reconnect you with those new permissions against whatever the new scope you've connected as. So at this point, I would have expected this to work now, but it worked both times. Close you for a minute. Oh, not too much. Yeah, okay, so that's kind of how it works and how it's broken apart. And then what I want to talk about and kind of push us into is prepare everyone for being able to take their AzureAD stuff and turning it into Microsoft.Graph stuff. And so step one for that is going to be how do we set it up so that we can use automation? And this is probably something that's a little better and easier than it would have been in previous, like Microsoft on the MS Online module didn't have anything for this. When I ran code against the Microsoft Online module, I would always still have to sign in as a normal user. And then I would just have, this exception of a user in my environment in order to be able to automate my code against it. The Graph module is built with the expectation that you're going to use an app registration to connect with. And the benefit of that is that it's going to alleviate the need for you to carry some sort of weird user off to the side, right? So in my old environment, every user in the environment had MFA enforced with the exception of the break glass account and this automation account. And moving forward with the Graph module, I'll be able to get rid of that automation account completely, and every user will have MFA enabled, just done, with the exception, of course, of the break glass account. And I'll be able to better secure what my code is doing against multiple app registrations that can do different things, right? So that's kind of what we're looking to do here. So we're going to use application and registration in AzureAD to be able to establish automation that's going to alleviate the need for passwords or user accounts in Azure Active Directory to connect to, and benefits us in ways like not having a requirement for MFA, things like that. In order to make the app registration, you may or may not have the permissions to do that. So you might have to engage a global admin or an application administrator in Azure AD in order to make the app registration for you so that you can run your code against it. So just be aware of that. And then what I've chosen to do is I have different security tiers. So for code that I'm using to just build reports out of Azure AD, I have just a read application registration, and then that's the only permissions it's given. And whenever I'm doing any sort of reporting, I make sure I use that application registration. And then I have a different application registration where I do all of my creates and updates off of. So that way, for the things that are actually affecting the environment, they're not blended in with the things that are just reporting on the environment. And so you can build different application registrations that are going to have different levels of permissions, or you might choose to do it by stack. And so anything that I'm doing that's affecting Exchange is going to use the Exchange application registration, and anything that's doing Azure AD stuff is using an Azure AD application registration, so on and so forth. And if that doesn't make sense yet, don't worry, we're about to go log into the portal, and then I'll show you how kind of what we're talking about for that. And then finally,
stop you there. Like, I think that's kind of what we're going to. Somebody asked a question in the chat, is that with app registrations running in Azure Runbook, how do you know what permission is needed in app registration?
So so whatever the permissions are part of the endpoint you're connecting to. So whether I'm doing an Azure Runbook or I'm doing it just in straight PowerShell or whatever it might be, it's whatever the thing that I'm interacting with on the graph endpoint determines the permission that I need. And so I just need to make sure that whatever that endpoint requires is given to the app registration as an API permission. And we're actually going to go set one of those up right after we move off of this slide. Is that a good answer?
Sounds good to me.
All right. And then the last thing is when you set your app registration up, there's two ways to authenticate. You can use a certificate or a secret. So if you're using a secret, you can store that in Azure Key Vault or something like that, and then access it that way. Personally, I prefer to use certificates. Most of the certificates that I make for this are self-signed certificates because I don't really see the need of setting up a CRL for all of that. If it ever goes gets got in some way, I can just pull the cert off the app registration. So, which would be the same as revoking a certificate in a certificate chain. So there's really not a need, I think, to add a whole lot of complexity to this. I like certificates though because they're more portable, I feel like, than trying to keep up with a bunch of secrets. So that's how I prefer to do mine, but you can do them however you want, either way. They're both pretty straightforward, and we can take a look at how each of those will look. So let's go ahead and build a application registration. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and log in here into Azure AD and my personal tenant. And then over under app registrations is where we can build something. Give it a moment. There we go. So what we'll do is we can come in and you can see that right now I don't have an app registration for us to connect to this environment and run code against it. So we're going to build a new registration and give it a name. And I'm just going to call this one Posh RTPSUG. An application registration is a broad thing. It can do many things. So for what we're using it for, it's very simple. However, if we wanted, if we were writing something with an OAuth workflow or something like that through it, there's a lot more about how we would how the user would interact with this, as far as pulling a access token and then getting redirected back to some other application, stuff like that. And so all of this that you see down in here is starting to work us through more bigger, grander things than we really need to concern ourselves with. All we want is a way to identify this thing in Azure that will give me back an access token so that I can interact with Graph on it, right? And then think of this like a service account, right? That's really what it is. So this is a thing that's going to give this is the service account user that you would have made in an on-premises AD, where you would go in and say, this user is a member of these groups, so we can go and do these things and nothing else, right? So that's what we're going to do here. The application registration is just that service account. So I'm going to name the service account and then hit register. We don't have to worry about anything else. And then once it's built, the things that I care about are the certificates and secrets and the API permissions. The rest of this really isn't going to do much for me, since I'm not doing anything bigger than authenticating the Graph module. So certificates and secrets is where we would add those. Like I said, so we could come in, we could just add a secret here, foo, choose how long the secret's good for, and then say add. And then this would automatically generate a secret for me. So this secret's going to be good for 2 years. This is the value, so I could copy that and then throw that in a notepad. And then when I go to write my code, I could just use this secret as the way that I'm connecting to the application registration if I wanted to. So the other way that we can do this is to come over to certificates and upload a certificate. And then when in our code, we just carry the cert with us or leave it in a place where our code can read that cert. And then that would be the thing that we're going to use for authentication instead. So 6.5 dozen. I'm going to choose to do the certificate route. So that way we have I think this is the way that would give us more options for anybody that's going to watch later. And so I wanted to try to give options, right? So the secrets one's pretty straightforward. You put in the secret here, carry it, put it somewhere that you can read it later, and then read that into your code from that point, however you want. So let's talk about how we're going to make a secret real quick, or a certificate real quick. So I have this new self-signed certificate, and this is how I was setting my splatting up. So instead of passing new self-signed certificate with this really long line of, dash friendly name, dash not before dash, I'm going to specify that in a hash table and then pass the hash table into my new self-signed certificate. And this will generate a certificate right here on the box for me. So this is how I choose to make mine. There's lots of options for new self-signed certificate, and you can get really crazy with the cheese whiz if you want to go with your own particular blend of, encryption standards or cryptography standards or key strengths or whatever you want to do. The defaults I think are 2048, and I don't remember the algorithm. I don't concern myself with these. This is what I said is my minimum though, right? Is a friendly name, so I know what it's looking for. I set the current date as the date I'm issuing. 2 years after today is when it will expire. And then I always pass both the subject and the subject alternate name for DNS. So if we go ahead and just run this real quick, down here in the bottom, it'll, wait, hold on. What did I do? Let's do that. All right, and then run that. Oh, now you gotta, hold on. Now we gotta wait. It has started. It's right here. Well, good job, Murphy. All right. So there we go. So here we can see that I've passed in these parameters into new self-signed certificate using a splat, stored that value in this cert variable, and then we output that cert variable just so we can take a look here at the certificate that it created. And so in memory, now I have a self-signed private certificate. And then what I do is after I have that certificate, I run the export Pfx certificate from the certificate we just stored in that variable, and that'll create me a private cert on the file system, with a Pfx. And so here we're just going to specify the location we want to save that Pfx, and then you'll need to encrypt the private key with something, right? And so here we're going to use this password, which is a secure password, to encrypt that private key. And so if we run that, boop, boop, over here on the left, we'll see the signed Pfx certificate now has been created. And so from this point forward, whenever I need to go do something, I can just read this self-signed certificate.pfx in, and then use that to authenticate to the application registration. So what that means now is when we go to upload certificate, we just want to go grab, oh, wait, not yet. Cancel. I'm one step short. Let me open this up, not you. This. So what we have is we've got the private certificate. So, and what Microsoft's going to want us to upload is the public certificate. And so we need to take this certificate that we just created and go ahead and install that into our MMC real quick. And then there might be an easier way to pull a public certificate, but I do not know it. So what I've always done is I just install my private certificate into my user store. And then here I can export the public certificate. And then once we do that, we can just go ahead and delete this because we don't care about it now. And so now if we take a look, you'll see we've got two files, right? So the self-signed cert.cert is my public certificate. We'll be able to open that one like we would anything else that we're used to being able to open and see, because it doesn't carry the private key with it. This is our public cert. And so we can see it's not trusted. It's issued to and it's issued by the same name. So there shows it's a self-signed certificate. And then here's my subject. And then if we scroll down to subject alternate name, here's the DNS value for that. So, and the valid from is today and then expires 2 years from today, right? And so that's the public side of what we built. And now if we come over to here, we can upload our public cert. There we go. So now what we've done is we've specified this application here is going to be the application that the Microsoft.Graph module is going to authenticate with, and it's going to pass in the private cert that goes along with this public cert. And so think of that as the application typing in its password. So since it has the private cert and the application registration as the public, then we know that these two things are the same or came from the same. And so that's going to allow me to authenticate to the application. And then for whatever permissions we assign this application is what any script will be able to do with it, right? And so we don't really need these, so we're going to go ahead and remove them. And then we're going to go ahead and add in some permissions right off the bat. So I know that I'm going to want this application to be able to create users. So under the user, there's a user read write all. So I'm going to provide permissions to the application. And I know that I'm going to want to create some groups. So let's go look for group. And there's a group read write all. We're going to go and add that as well. So as it stands, the application has permissions to users and groups read write all. However, it's not been granted admin consent, which is required in order for these to work, because the application would only be able to interact on itself unless a global admin comes in and says otherwise. And so when we're granting admin consent for this, we're saying that this application can go out and connect to other users as well, essentially is what we're doing. So we're going to go ahead and grant consent. These will come over to the green checkboxes. And at this point, I'm ready to authenticate using the application itself instead of my own identity. So how do we do that? So in order to do that, we're going to come back over to connect-graph, and we're going to see that there's a couple different parameters. One of them is client ID, one of them is certificate, and one of them is tenant ID. And those are the things that we care about right now, right? So if we go and we take a look back at what we created under overview, we can see that there is a client ID. So this is the username of our service account. And this is the domain of our service account right here under tenant ID. And then the certificate is going to be our password. That's kind of how this is going to line up between, what we would have done in Active Directory versus what we're going to do in Azure AD. So let me go ahead and disconnect Graph and clear the screen. And then we need to reconnect back up, right? So we're going to do it interactively first right now. So step one is I need to grab my certificate again. Make sure I have something for this. New export. Yeah, right here. So we're going to go in and we're going to grab our certificate, and we're going to do that by specifying the location that the certificate's in, and then the secret password so we can decrypt the private key, and then store that value into our certificate. From there, we're going to want to establish a new splat that holds the client ID, the tenant ID, and the certificate. And then we're going to pass that into connect graph. And I guess we should also, well, that's it. That's all we need.
Jeremy,
Right?
2 quick questions.
Sir.
When it comes to the certificate, is 2 the limit to 2 years, or is there a max?
2 is not the limit. You can go bigger than 2. I'm not sure how big. I don't know what the max would be. I don't issue anything for greater than 2 years.
Okay.
You really shouldn't.
And
You really shouldn't
the-
even use 2 years anymore because Max won't support it.
yeah,
300,
that's what
367 days or something like that is recommended.
okay. And is there a way to find out? Is there something in Azure to let you know when those certificates are expiring,
Um,
or do you have to keep track of them yourself?
so when something's expiring, like if you just go look, it'll tell you in the console. In fact,
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw, but the other thing
Yeah,
that I had in here, you know, it told you that it was expiring soon because I have a secret in there that needs to get re-rolled. I
But
found,
there's no like email notification of any way to let you know that. So unless you're in the console and looking at it.
I don't believe there's anything automated that does that. You'd have to like, or there's something out of the box. You'd have to roll your own to go.
Yeah,
You
find
have to roll your own. Okay.
there's no, I think it's this one.
If
There's
you
no,
if
Go
you
ahead.
put your owner's your email address, when it's expired, it will email you.
yeah, there's nothing that's what I was going to say. There's nothing that goes proactively. So
Okay.
you can set your email as the thing to be notified. Russ Rimmerman, I ran across this thing and I thought it would be a fun way to kind of play with Power Automate. And so I used this to, wait, is this the right one? This isn't the one I wanted. Hold on.
I put it in
I'll
the
have to-
chat. Sarah Lean showed how to use Azure Monitor to do this.
Okay.
Oh, well, that's a different
And-
one. So, because I found one, I used Power Automate, and it will email me for anything that's expiring within the next 2 weeks.
Okay.
This is the one I used right here.
Okay, so there is one in Power
So
Automate.
I'll throw that
Okay,
in chat.
that's cool. And
Well, there's like you build it, you know what I mean?
yeah,
Like
you
it's
have to
nothing.
build it. Yeah. Okay.
So, but this is the
So it's
walkthrough that I
possible.
used
Okay.
to be proactive, and this will work you through. It'll go grab all of the app registrations in your tenant, and then it'll loop through each of those app registrations. And then if you're going to expire in the next 14 days, it will send you an email. Where's the email? Right here. You'll
effectively,
build it
there's-
so that it's
Yeah, so effectively, there's a lot of ways to accomplish it. Here's 2 examples of using Power Automate. Then there's Azure Monitor, but it's going to have to roll your own and to
Yeah.
the only variables that you want to go. How far do you want to go out? Who do you want to automate? Who do you want to alert? That kind of stuff.
yeah.
Okay, good. And lastly, I noticed that you gave when you do the app registration, you're giving it access to the entire tenant. Is there a way to limit the users that it has access to?
Not that I'm aware of. You can limit the access it has. You can give it read or you can give it read write. But Azure AD's flat. There's no like, OU structure where I can choose to only give it to a subset of the users.
So you can't use like a distribution group of members in this district group. So I say these people in this security group or distribution group.
Well, you're
leave
talking about
it
to
at-
give permissions to it? Like, I can grant more users access to the application registration, but the application registration is either going to have read or read write to users.
Okay. The reason why I ask is because I have to probably end up registering an application for the company, new application, and the application is only run by one of our subdomains, one of our sub companies. And I didn't want it to give access to everybody. That's why I asked.
I see. Yeah, because when you're syncing it into Azure AD, you're still syncing everything into the same users bucket.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
there may be a way. I just don't know it.
Okay.
But I'm not aware of a way to limit by like, you know, UPN
Yeah.
or something like that,
Yeah.
so that it only has write access on a subset of the users that are synced into Azure AD.
Okay.
All right. So
Thanks.
so let's go ahead and copy this client ID. We're going to throw that into here. And then let's go copy the tenant ID. We're going to throw that right here. And then the certificate is going to be the thing right up here that we read in. So we can just not do that. And then specify our cert right there. And so now we're going to read that certificate into memory, right here. And then from that certificate, we're going to attach the certificate to this application in this domain, this application in this domain, and connect up. So let's see if we got that right. Boom. And so now I'm not connected. I'm actually connected as this POSH RTPSUG automation application. And so if my Azure AD requires things like MFA, or if my user account isn't an account that needs elevated permissions and I want work to happen, or if I'm trying to, you know, separate the work that I'm doing off of my cron server away from an actual user account, you know, we've achieved that goal, right? So all I need to do is carry this private certificate and this little bit of code right here and use that to connect up, and whatever permissions are set on this application in Azure, we can interact with in Microsoft.Graph. So let's go and do something with that. So I've got this code here that I made up, and it's just playing around with identities a little bit. So I'm going to build a UPN. I'm going to take the name, clean it up. If it's hyphenated, do some stuff like that. And then down here is where the real code is. So I'm going to go grab 20 random users. And then for those 20 random users, I'm going to clean up their first and last names. I'm going to establish the first 3 characters of their first name and their last name, if they have 3. Otherwise, I'm just going to take all of it. And then I'm going to take the first 3 of their first name, the first 3 of their last name, and the 4 digits of the year, stuff them all together to build a default password. And then we're going to go create a bunch of brand new users using the new MG user commandlet. And these will be all of the parameters of the new MG user commandlet that I'm going to pass in, right? So, and just so we can go see this work, right now, if we look in my users, I have 2 users, right? The account that we're running for the demo, and then my actual account that I pay for my Azure off of. So we're going to go ahead and hit F5. And this is going to take a second, mostly because this new identity thing is something I made as a serverless app, and so I have to wait on it to spin up. There we go. So now we can see it's going through and building all of our users right now. And then if we come back over here and we wait, it's usually not incredibly fast. So I was graced this time. So we can see we've created all of my different users now inside of AzureAD using the Graph module. And then along with the users, so if we go take a, let's go explore one of those users. So Flory Elliott, we can see has a UPN. I captured the state that Flory lives in, the city that Flory lives in, so the department that Flory works in, the company, and then I'm giving everybody a job title of temp so we can filter on that and delete them later. And so now I want to be able to put all of these users in groups that go along with their departments, right? So let's go do that next. So I went ahead and created this new graph groups, and for my identity app, I'll only ever put them in these departments. And so I just made a quick array of only those departments. And then we're going to go through and create a group for each one. So let's do that. And then boom, those are all done. And so if we go back over to here and we look under groups, we will see all of the groups created. And in each of these groups right now, we currently don't have any members. So let's fix that. And we can do that using this. And so in this one, I'm going to go ahead and go grab all of the users that are currently in my tenant. I often make one expensive call at the very beginning versus repeated small calls. And I think in the grand scheme of things, it's cheaper, right? So I could either connect to AzureAD every time I need to loop through the next user to pull information about that user. And then after that, go and do the next step. And then when I get to the next user, go pull it again. And then you have all of that extra latency for the connection happening over and over and over. And if you're doing that for a large scale of users, that can be quite a bit of time added to your script's execution time. So most of the time, what I'll do is I'll just go grab the complete user data set, well, the complete users set, but I will only pull the subset of the data that I need. So this will give me not a whole lot of storage, but everything that I need in memory right from the start. So in this instance, for all of my users, if we go ahead and just run like this command, for instance, and then we take a look at all users down here, you'll see, actually, let me go ahead and format list that. So here we can see that I have a user object returned back from graph that has nothing in it, right? Surname, given name, so display name, nothing exists in here other than what I asked for, which was department and then ID. These are the only two real values that I've got, right? And that's because that's all I need. So if we take a look, coming into the new group member, the only thing that's really required is going to be the ID of the user. And so that's the only reason I'm pulling that through. And then I'm pulling the department because I'm going to need to know filter on that so that I can grab the appropriate groups for each department. So that's what we're about to go through. So grid all of my users, which is their object ID and their department. And then for every, for all of my users, we're going to group them by department and then select just that value. So that gives me a list of all of the departments, and we can just execute that by itself real quick. And then take a look at groups. And you can see here's my list of all of the groups from there. And then for each of those groups, we're going to go through, and then I have some users that aren't in a group. So what I'm doing here is I'm filtering out anything that doesn't have a group. And then from there, I'm going to take each of those groups, find the group, and then take that user. And if that user's in the group, add them to the group. And so let's go through and execute this. All right, and now if we go take a look, accounting and finance, and this might take a second, so already there. So we can see here, we now have our 2 members from accounting and finance. Inside that one, go to management, we'll have some members inside this one, the 1 user. Okay, and so we've worked our way through now, creating users, creating groups, adding users to groups, and then all that's left is to go clean up and do some removal stuff. And so this is kind of like I said, my goal for this was to kind of give some starting points for how do you make users with Graph. So that would be this area here. How do you make groups with Graph? That would be this area here. How do we add users to groups? That would be this command here. And then removing is going to be really simple, right? Just go find stuff and remove them. So, and then some of the other things that are worth looking at is when you're looking in the Graph module for something. So get MG user. Actually, it's right here. I'm just going to use this one. So there is a filter option that is supported for most of your Git endpoints in the Microsoft.Graph module. However, they're almost like what you're used to in the AD module, right? So these use an OData filter set. And so if I should have added this to the list of things. Just do that, probably get the whole thing. That's not the one I want. That's the one I wanted. Normally this is really easy to get to. You're just taking me back and forth. Let's just type OData filter. So that's just filtering. I'll have to go look for, there's a more general OData usage set that would be worthwhile. So this is just for filter, but everything inside of here, this is what we can use against the filter. So when you're passing in a filter, all of this is available to you. And things like starts with and ends with weren't things that you could have ever used, in the Active Directory module, but they are available to you here. So if you wanted to only pull users to do work against of a certain kind of UPN, if you had multiple names and, I have Tailspin Toys, I have, Criminy Toys, I have everything for coffee, all right of the @ sign, and I only wanted those things that were Tailspin Toys, you could use the ends with in order to pull back just those users, right? And these are the things too where coming over and playing in the Graph Explorer for them is helpful. So, if we went to the user's endpoint, this will pull back all of my users just as I did with get MG user, and I can see all of the information that's available to me. And so if I wanted to only pull back, let's do filter equal and then get, see if I got that right. I did not. Starts with, so I typed something wrong. User.
I think you need the dollar sign behind filter.
Yep. Thank you. It's funny how they only do what you tell them to, right? There we go. And so here we can see I'm only going to pull back users that have a given name with A, so that's emit. And then if we change that to, I think there was one with an F, right? So we can do an F. And so here we see Fedora Graber and Flory Ellicott are returned back. And so I find it easier for me personally to work inside Graph Explorer when I need to come up with this kind of work. And then once I have what I want working correctly, then I'll come over and add that in to my filter appropriately under here, right? So that's kind of how I personally work between the Graph module and Graph Explorer.
Jeremy, I hate to interrupt, but on some of the older modules, they would do OData queries, but would only support starts with. All right, does this actually support all the functions like end with and stuff like that? Or is it still just starts with?
So and this is why I spent so much time in this documentation is if we look at list users graph. This documentation will tell you what's supported. And so the Microsoft.Graph module will support anything that the endpoint supports. So but there's nothing like if I Google get-mg user and go pull this documentation, there's nothing in this documentation that tells you about what filter do. And like I said, this one's actually a poor example because they're actually giving you information here, right? Let's go pick a different one. New-mg user, no, group member, right? So we just ran this command. This is how you add a user to a group. So, but there's nothing in here that tells me anything about what permissions I need to add that user to a group or anything like that, right? But it will tell me what I can pass in, what can be passed in the body, right? And then if there's anything for what I can and can't do across the graph data, it won't tell me any of that here. But if I come over into here and we go to groups, and then we find where are you? Where I swear I just saw you. This is what's going to give me what will and won't be accepted the endpoint. I don't really concern myself with all of the super developer-y information about like what would be in the request and then the response and how I'm C# code or something. But I do myself with documentation for permissions and then like on the gets, which parameters in OData will be accepted. Because you're right, there's a ton of things that might be available to me within OData, but only certain portions of that would be available in that particular commandlet. And anything that it's all about what the API, the endpoint supports, not necessarily what the module commandlet itself supports.
Okay. I think you're talking about the properties that the endpoint returns. I'm talking about the filter command function, OData functions. So like you were filtering on name starts with A. Will it also
Right.
support ends with MIT?
Right. Okay, I see. I'm not sure. That's a great question.
Okay, because that's been a major frustration with the older commands because it only supported starts with.
Yeah, that's a good question.
You want
Yeah,
to try?
because I'm talking, yeah, you're right. I was one step above you about which OData parameters can you use, not necessarily within that parameter, what can you do?
Just try it, Jeremy. Just like go to your
Yeah.
and
That's what I was about to do. Let me. So. Do one. What did we just do? Give a name. That should return both of mine. All right, and we know that I got at least one with an E, so we'll switch that to an E and do ends with. Yep, unsupport a query. So it does not appear that it supports ends with still. So good call out.
and if you do that from Graph Explorer, will it give you the same thing? So you can discover using Graph Explorer.
Yeah, so yeah, if we do ends with here, it'll work. And we chose E, right? No. This should have worked. Oh,
What if
you
you
know
use
what?
the beta?
Try. Hold on. There might not be for a first name. Because I was thinking of give surname. Because it was Ellicott, Flory Ellicott that I was thinking of. Yeah, there isn't an E there, but I do have an E under surname. Dang it, ends with an E though. I'm working too quick and not thinking my way through this. So we want surname ends with T. Right?
Yep.
So ends with surname T should at least get me Flory Ellicott. That does not appear to like ends with even here. I know I've used ends with before.
If you use the beta,
Maybe I didn't use it on users.
What if you use the beta endpoint?
Let's try. Nope. So yeah. So again, good call out. Your mileage may vary on the ones you want to use. And again, I find it easier to mess with that here than I do in the actual module itself. So this is how I build those things out. And then once you get it working and you have it right, you can easily copy this into the filter of your command to go pull the data that you want afterwards.
All right. Thanks, Jeremy.
So
Thanks so much.
yeah, so then the last thing then would be, let's go ahead and purge the users back or the groups out. And again, here I'm just getting all of the groups and then looping through them and deleting them all. And then the same for the users, except I don't want to delete all the users. I just want to delete all the ones that are created. So since I gave them all the same job title, we're going to filter on temp and then just go delete all of those users real fast. All right, and now hop on back over here. And all my users are gone. And all my groups are gone. And that's really it. That's all I had. So moving forward, we did all of that as well. And good questions. Like I said, my goal for this was mostly just to give something that would, kind of help people get started moving off of tools for where you can look, where you can play, and then give you some starter code for what I feel like would probably be pretty common things like creating users, deleting users, creating groups, deleting groups, and adding users to groups. So at least there's some breadcrumbs to start the Google path on.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Jeremy. And appreciate the content. All right.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.